I wanted to show you this book, Omar. It's called 100 عام على اتفاقية Sykes-Picot, 100 years after Sykes-Picot, a reading in maps. It's by Dr. Bassam Abdelkader Naamani. I came across it not too long ago. Obviously, many of us who teach and talk about Palestine, we see maps all the time on the web. But what I thought was extremely powerful in this book is that it's, I think, in my humble opinion, the most documented and most clear study of all the different maps that have been drawn about a region, about Bilad al-Sham and Palestine, by colonial powers. And it's extremely well documented, and it has an explanation. And if you go through it, I want to show you a couple of maps, maybe out of all the maps here, that speak as well to where we are, which is Lebanon. Firstly, the impression you get, of course, is that the colonial powers saw us as simply territory and resources, and they drew these lines based on their interest, and often they fought between each other in order to determine who gets the best resources and the best land based on their interests. So the British, for example, were highly concerned about their connection to India. The French were very interested in capturing parts of Syria that they thought had communities they could actually have relations with. So this is one of the maps I wanted to show you, is this map, I believe drawn by a British general of Palestine. And what is interesting about it is this general, and hopefully eventually I'll provide you with the details, he's drawn what he thought was the just claims of the Zionist movement, using this cross-haired line. You see that one? And then what the Zionists themselves have actually demanded as their rightful property during the Paris conference after World War I. So long ago, over 100 years ago, if you look at the map, you'll notice this is where the Dead Sea is. You see, they imagined Israel on Palestine, not based simply on Talmudic or biblical claims, but based on what they thought was strategic, in the sense that wherever they had waterfronts, rivers, resources, and it goes all the way into modern day Jordan, because this is where the Dead Sea is. It goes all this aside, that this is where we are. Actually, we are right here today. Now today, this is in modern day Lebanon, but you can see that the Zionists saw Palestine, between quotation marks, in their mind, as coming all the way here. And this explains partly, when we have kind of a conversation together, why they are still intent on destroying parts of Lebanon, and why for them these borders that many of us today consider national borders, the Zionists never respected. And they saw as much as they could get. I want to show you one more map. It's very similar, but it's colored maybe. This is just a way of maybe showing you almost the same thing. But for those 100, this one, maybe this is clearer. Pretty much the same boundaries with a difference. You see, this is the Negev, al-Naqab, the Naqab desert. One of the proposals of the Zionists did not include al-Naqab. It included mostly the fertile regions well into Egypt, all the way across the Palestinian coast to Haifa, Akka, Yafa, and again all the way up to the south of Saida. The Litani River, the famous Litani River, a lot of people hear about when agreements, is over here. And you see that the two water surfaces, the Dead Sea and Tabaraya, are inside, totally inside. So in this map, parts of Jordan, parts of Egypt, and parts of Lebanon and parts of Syria are included in the Zionist plan. And this actually contradicts claims that sometimes are expressed by politicians or governments in Egypt or Jordan or Syria. We have nothing to do with Palestine. If we leave the Zionists alone, they're going to leave us alone. And I don't think that's the case. And actually today's genocide and war is proving that any time Israel historically has the opportunity to expand, it is by definition an expansionist state. Great to have you in Saida. It's really great, and especially in this beautiful place under a mulberry tree. I was just telling Rabieh, I haven't sat under a tree and had this kind of conversation for a long time, which says, I guess, a lot about the new urban life we live most of the time for many of us. But it's great to be with you.
Thank you for bringing us here. It's a beautiful place, really.
I think it's a special spot in Saida, but also in Lebanon. Actually, this place we are at. But Saida is you showed us some of the maps. Amazing how Saida is so connected, even in the mind of the settler colonial project, the Zionist settler colonial project. That is, Saida has always been present in this connection with Palestine. So no wonder we feel as Palestinians this closeness, I would say, to Saida. So looking at the maps, Saida has most of the time been part of the colonial map.
Yes, and on not just that, I could tell you that when the Zionists were actually sending agents to purchase land, we have records of them telling the agents, please look in areas wherever you find anything that could be bought, including areas close to Saida.
Yeah.
And other, of course, countries. So it's been definitely in their plans. But on the opposite side, as you very well know, Rabieh, it's also been a place that's generally been very welcoming and home to Palestinian, not just Palestinians in general, but Palestinian resistance. Saida historically, although it has changed in the last 20-30 years, but historically it's been a hub for national liberation struggle movements over here. Nasserism was very powerful in Saida as a current, a political current early on. And to be honest, I would argue, I grew up in this city. Generally, people don't care as much, or used to not care as much about your background in Saida. So I would think of it as such.
And you're a historian.
Yes, I am a historian. Somehow,
historian is
yes,
called.
yes, but I would say not by chance, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to do for a long time, and I did a lot of things. Not because I wanted to do a lot of things, because I was lost, and I used to like stories, and at the same time I do like politics, sociology, and then economics to an extent. Eventually, though, I figured if you want to be someone who's very interdisciplinary, history is a place. History is a study of the past. Anything you'd want to study, you can, and you can claim it's history in a sense. So history gave me the ability to both engage in a literary fashion with the world and at the same time understand the past. That's why I do history.
So does the there's many there's many people have different views how the struggle, where's the secret of the struggle, So do you believe as a historian that the key of the liberation of Palestine is understanding the history, or is it just it's one tool of many tools, or is it the main tool?
It's actually absolutely necessary to understand the history of the Zionist movement and the Zionist settler colonization of Palestine in order for us to hopefully liberate Palestine. But it's certainly not enough, because I do believe that history seeps into the present. What you do in the past will impact what is happening today. But I'm not someone who thinks history determines the future in a kind of absolute sense. So I think that if we want to fight this project, we have to understand its origins. We also have to understand its structure, which has changed over time. And we have to understand also the ideology and the thinking, the inner thinking of the settler colonial movement to be able to actually resist it. But it's you can still understand a lot of history. I remember seeing a cartoon that was nice, is that the destiny of historians is to this proverb about history repeats itself, is to keep watching history repeat itself. So if you don't have a political movement that takes up the struggle, even if you know a lot of history, it's not a basically guarantee.
No, a historian cannot make revolution sitting at home in his study room. He cannot make revolution by himself.
No, not only.
Yeah. Sorry, people has. I'm also remembering a proverb from the Aborigines of America, the southern part, when they say to give history a sense of dynamic. They say we look at the past going to the future. So for them, it's a dynamic. It's a thing in motion. The present is what you're living now, but they don't mention it. They say we look at the past going towards the future. So it's emotional. So if it's we cannot. I mean, separating now we're separating the historian, which is you, but you mentioned also being a storyteller or liking stories. You enjoy stories, and people have stories. This is how people do. People transmit their stories from one generation to the next generation, most of the time for the sake of learning, most of the time for the sake of progressing and developing and moving forward. In this case, you know, the colonial presence challenged that idea for us as peoples of this region. They challenged it because they interrupted that path of history to create a new direction for it.
I think I want to, if the idea of interrupting history is important, and the idea of how much we are affecting our own history or actually drawing our own history. But there's 2 points to actually build on Rabieh's point. First, that this idea of a specialized historian is not actually, the main point is that the people of the region know their history, they also have oral history, but because of colonialism and the relative distance between now and what happened in the past, we are in a point where sometimes this history has been actually either perverted or denied or obscured. And so what I sometimes feel that although we are reminded by the Israeli wars of the savagery of this or the bestiality of this project, there's a lot of historical information or knowledge that is being either intentionally or unintentionally lost. And so retrieving it sometimes is, maybe the historian's job is to retrieve it, but actually the history of a people does not reside with the historian, it resides with the collective memories and the collective expression of that history that used to happen in the past through not just the university or the school or the house, but through political parties, through engaging with kind of common and public expressions of that history. Sometimes today we are faced, and I can speak more of Lebanon because I don't know about other places, with a deliberate attempt to somehow either describe some of that history as irrelevant, or who cares about what happened in the past, we have to look after just what is happening today, or that we are tired of that history and we should just forget what happened and just accept the current present. So history is also a weapon of the present, and you can use it not just to tell people what happened, but to also actually support your struggle today by invoking certain arguments or counter arguments, because also we know that the Zionist narrative itself is always relying on history, sometimes on myth that dates back thousands of years to also legitimate.
And also also the modern history of Palestine is, and I would say even today, do you feel as a historian with an Arab background, you see today we can see even in the pro-Palestinian movement, where the historians who are setting the examining or leading the narrative in the pro-Palestinian movements today, they have Israeli and or Jewish background. You take like Norman Finkelstein or Ilan Pippé, they're also with both of them Israeli or with Jewish background. It's not Arab historian. It's not the historians with Arab background who are actually their version of history, which is implemented deeply into the Palestinian movement. It is still the white man with a Jewish background who's controlling the narrative. Is that a problem, you believe, as an Arab historian?
Well, let me be precise, because this is a question is a bit. It's important for us to break down this question.
I know it's a bit complicated.
So, firstly, you know there are incredibly brilliant Arab and Palestinian historians specifically who have written a lot on the history of Palestine. You know, from the older generation, the most known in the academy perhaps is somebody like Walid Khalidi, for example, who's written a lot before Ilan Pappé writes about ethnic cleansing. Another, of course, important is Noor Masalha's work on expulsion and transfer. I'm just mentioning a couple, but there's a lot more.
Which I think almost nobody knows them.
You see, that's the point. So this is my second point, is that the problem sometimes is who gets promoted in a certain condition, and some Jewish historians like Ilan Pappé specifically, I think, has done a wonderful contribution to our struggle and is welcome. Sometimes it's the Zionist narratives who dominate, or it's Israeli scholars who are saying the same thing that Arab scholars or Palestinian scholars are saying, So you're right to point out that the Arab historiography, that's what we call, the study or the production of history, is not always promoted, is not always actually referred to. And while this may seem like a superficial point, some people will say, who cares as long as we are telling the right history? I would argue that actually it's very important for people to, just like with the question of, for example, women scholars or people who we think should be role models and who can tell the story from the point of view of their people in a way that it's near impossible, even if you empathize, can. So yes, that is in the West. We do have a in Arabic history.
You live in Toronto, yeah. So
I live in Vancouver.
In Vancouver, yeah. So of course, so you're very well. How to say? Known about the Western culture, but don't you think also it sounds maybe banal, but it's like the people in the West, even the one who believe or who sympathize with the Palestinian struggle, they need to have the history served by white people for them to. Because if it's an Arab historian, it's like he must have an agenda. Maybe can we trust it completely, or maybe it's because he has an Islamic agenda or some other agenda we don't know about. But it's easier for them to digest if it's served by somebody they can mirror themselves.
Some with the good intention of saying, but if it comes from a Western historian, a Jewish, in this case, if we're thinking the historians you mentioned, then it gives a stronger argument, and then it convinces those who don't listen to the Palestinian narrative or to the Palestinian story. It will prove it right, and that's again I'm agreeing with you, Omar, that and of course you, Hicham, in this that it is crucial that we try and work slowly and steadily towards that. Our story has to be listened to, and our story matters, and anyone who's backing that story up is welcome to, but it has to be our story, and people has to have the I think we're defined wrongly in the West.
Of course, I acknowledge we should acknowledge the great work some of them they do, but the problem is some of them deliberately or undeliberately they control the narrative in the Palestinian movement, so they control our narrative. It means that I believe personally it's a problem that no Palestinian historians are being promoted in the West, or not even in the Palestinian movement.
I mean, I'm thinking of some of my colleagues and comrades, Palestinian, who recently, in my generation and the younger generation, at least in North America, I don't know, maybe also in Europe it can be different, are very actually vocal and present, frontline and center. And we have, after Edward Said, the production of Arab, not just history, Arab politics, Arab literature on Palestine has proliferated. And we have a second and third generation of Arabs who are very well spoken, don't have an accent, who can actually speak to the West. But you're right to point out, there is still a persistent underlying prejudice. Even ENPP, I think he did some damage in the beginning or after the 7th of October. Because he went on. Because you're focusing on a name and you're naming someone. I would say if there's one person we shouldn't necessarily focus on, it's Ilham Papi. Because he's the only one in my mind who not only has actually told the Palestinian story without apology, but at a minimum also is now not living in Palestine, and has, after October 7, I would argue he might be one of the only ones who did not rush to actually defend Israel's right to exist. I can name other Jewish scholars who were supposed to be allies, and all of a sudden after October 7, they had this for instance, I don't want to name names, but they became somehow hesitant, because you could feel that somehow in their blood or in their there was a visceral reaction, which is not supposed to come out of a historian.
My point is that he still did some damage, I believe, personally, because just after the 7th of October, I think it was some months after, he said that he talked about the atrocities on the 7th of October and the rape and the raping of Hamas and the Palestinian groups, which later turned out to be never proven. So he actually he tuned in on this narrative of Palestinian raping and killing and beheading children in just after he did this.
I haven't heard that.
But I'm saying but my point is if had it been an Arab historian.
So you're right. Okay, so not right. I don't want to say okay. I
Okay.
take that back
Yeah.
because you said a lot of things. So I
Yeah.
don't want to say you're right about a lot of things.
Of course.
You know, because I may disagree with some things you said.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, but actually, if we want to apply your critique, we should stop talking about them. Just to see if we actually refocus the conversation. I wanted to point out that one of the problems is not just what they say, is the fact that we are always centering them, whether by praising them or criticizing them. One of the things I really struck me when I was reading Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, a long time ago, is the introduction by Jean-Paul Sartre. And one of the things that Paul Sartre says, if I remember correctly, is he says this is a dangerous book, or something to that effect. It's a very important book. Why? Because he says Fanon is no longer speaking to the European. He's actually speaking to the people of the global south. So what I'm trying to point out is, if the issue is not just an individual in this case, and I know that's maybe where you're getting at, the issue is constantly having to, there are two issues here. One is the question of credibility, that if an Arab says something, he's suspect. He's not just suspect in terms of, by the way, his politics. He's suspect in terms of his accuracy and his methodology and his professionalism. So as a historian, he's not as good, even if he's good intentioned. So this is a problem. The same way we have historically this idea that if you gender prejudice, that if you're a woman, for example, and you said something, well, I'm not sure if it's rational.
The Arab is a little bit more stupid.
So the stupidity of the Arab, exactly, and also his inability or her inability to actually conduct history in a professional manner. The second issue we are talking about is the extent to which we are telling our own story with all its complications, and we are not trying to start our conversation about Palestine with, for instance, the Jewish issue. So I used to teach, when I started teaching Palestine, how I learned it, I would start with Zionism in Europe, and then I come to Palestine. Then I learned, no, I will start with what people were like in Palestine, how they lived, the landscape. So the first thing that the student sees is not the important problem of anti-Semitism in Europe. That's not where the conversation starts. Today, our problem is there's an insistence on beginning everything with our position on anti-Semitism. This is a European problem. We must start with Palestine, with the land, with the people, with the history, and then how the people and the land and the history was subject to something that came from somewhere else for other reasons, and how that something else affected them, how it actually transformed their life, changed the world. So starting with Palestine, centering Palestine, I think is the best response to what you're talking, rather than getting into the question of who did what and how. I think that's the best response we can make, that actually shifts the conversation without necessarily going back to who did what.
And I have a feeling that in the past 18 months to 19 months now of an ongoing genocide in Gaza and an ethnic cleansing of our people in the region and wherever we are, even the political ethnic cleansing of us, there has been strong realizations on that front. People don't want to talk about other things. They want to talk about the story of our people, and they want to reflect about it, and they want to get to know it much more and understand it to a higher depth. And I think this is a fundamental part of it. What you're saying right now, right? Part of this conversation also is so important because then we can, share it with others, and the more we share, and this is where we worried. How can we get the story of the Palestinian also from the historian, also from the academic who has studied it, because part of being colonized is that we have lost a lot of our stories. We have lost a lot of our elderly who could tell us the stories. The complete story, not the stories in small pieces and the way that could be reminded by one or another. So therefore, we're going back to the historian. The historian becomes an important element, again going back to the first question you raised, the historian becomes a fundamental element in the struggle, in the liberation, because the historian has the story that we're missing, the missing links of that story as well. And I remember now we had a conversation with also one of your colleagues, Hazem Jamjoum, young, very engaged, and his talk about the history was impressive as well. We needed that part that he had studied himself, because we're missing our elderlies. Again, I say it's so important. The more I'm insisting on the elderly, because our storytelling structures, as you were also referring, how crucial it was the Zionist movement to us as people, and the colonial power that came on us and upon us. Then they destroyed the structures that we used to tell our story. How the families used to tell their stories in their traditional ways, and in the collective, and how the villages, how the Bedouins, how in the city it used to be, how they structured, like the whole, everything that structured our narrative, our story, was broken down into pieces since early century. I'm referring to the 20th century, that is, mostly, because it intensified in that period. And it is therefore, going back to the importance of the historian, I think it's a crucial element in the building up of our liberation struggle against colonialism.
So a crucial thing about our history. Now I'm sitting. Now we have the pleasure of sitting with an Arab historian here who actually knows what he's talking about, especially about the Palestinian issue. Yeah, I hope so. Well, history will tell.
Yes,
yeah.
history will judge me.
History will judge you. So how do you define? Because I believe one of the ideological struggles now with the Zionists is the definition of the people, of the indigenous people belonging to the land. So how will you define a Palestinian? How will you, also from a history point of view, what is the Palestinian? What is his origin?
I'd like to first hear Rabieh on this point, but before I do, and I will speak a little bit about maybe the question of indigeneity and Palestine. Maybe that's what you're also asking me in a really nice way. History is also, to add to what Rabieh said about telling the story. In my case, I derive strength from knowing the long history of the struggle, not just, of course, of the settler colony. I put things into perspective. So when you suffer during, let's say, a war or ethnic cleansing, when you are displaced, when you are attacked, whether verbally or even physically, and you know about the long path that others before you have taken, you know the stories of both defeats and victories, you know that this is not something that started just 1 year and a half. You know of other histories, like the history of the liberation of Algeria that took 130 years. Sometimes this historical consciousness, that's what you should call it, a historical consciousness, can actually empower you to resist and to withstand very difficult and sometimes impossible conditions of suffering and struggle. So this is where history is also not just telling the story, it's actually about you are part of that history. You're not uprooted. See, this is the point about settler colonialism. From your people, and not just those who live with you today, but those who existed in the past. So this is also, it can be sometimes frustrating history, because you're like, who cares, what matters, it's up. But as a matter of fact, that's what keeps sometimes me personally going, is that I know there are people before me, I know what Palestine looked like before, I know that even if we are facing now possibly the unspeakable horror of a genocide, the faith in hopefully overcoming this is derived from history. Because I do think, by the way, Palestine, I think, is the last settler colonial European state in the old world, so to speak, you know. So also the logic of history tells me that it is almost, I wouldn't say inevitable, because who fights for something can win it, but they are fighting also under conditions that historically do not usually sustain themselves. This idea of an ethno-national supremacist state. And this is why they're committing now genocide. Because they are aware that despite all they did, they got to a point where even the demographic balance, which they were obsessed with, they were obsessed with two things, the Zionists: land and demography. You know, more land and a majority Jewish state to sustain supremacy. And every time this balance breaks, they commit atrocities. And so at the same time, the same atrocities are an indication of the failure of that project to sustain itself, because eventually you can't just use violence to actually govern or to exist. You need something else. Sorry, I kind of went into a different point here. But I don't know if you want to add something about who is a Palestinian, or how do you see Palestine, and then I can hopefully add something else.
Yeah, I mean, maybe in a simple tense, and I hope you correct me as well. I mean, in the basic of it is, the Palestinian is just a result of all the history of the people who inhabited that land. So basically, there is no reclamation of anyone in particular to say, this is mine, or this is me, this is us here. This is how we define ourselves. And I think but then again, we need to go back to the history and read it fully, so we can see who we are. I don't want to go into the genetics of us, because I think it's the wrong when we go there. But
for example, to say that we are the result of the Canaanites and
it's the whole, it's all the peoples who came. The minute someone reclaims the being the original of this people due to certain part of the history, then we're wrong. I'm not sure how to define it, but I think for me, in confrontation of a supremacist group that is now colonizing Palestine and reclaiming its history and its geography and the richness in it
you don't believe that we have to at least make a point or take it seriously when they keep attacking us with these European Jews coming from Poland and Russia, claiming they belong to the land because they're Jewish?
No, but that's exactly where
I can make a few maybe points about that.
Yeah, but that's exactly my point. It's the inheritance of that land are the ones who have been who have been living in that land for the years before Nakba. But
let me say a couple of points about that, Omar, if I may. Firstly, on the face of it, let's assume that the European Zionists, Jewish Zionists, by the way, many European Jews initially neither related in that manner nor actually supported Zionism. But that aside, let's assume for the sake of argument that they were the descendants of people who lived here 2,000 years ago. I mean, I can go into the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judea that they discuss and talk about. The period in which these kingdoms they refer to, from based on biblical history, existed here, pales in comparison to the existence of Byzantium, Islamic, Arab, and other polities and other governments that existed. So that in and of itself can never be an excuse. Secondly, the word Palestine has been used almost for 3,000 years to refer to this region. The Zionists themselves, if you look at all the organizations they set up initially, Jewish Development Company, Anglo-Palestine Bank, they themselves would refer to this land as Palestine.
Come to Palestine.
Herzl, exactly. Herzl, in his diaries, there's I think 113, don't quote me on this, references to Palestine. There's like less than half to Israel. But here's the point. If you think someone has the right to return to their land after leaving after 2,000 years, what about someone who was displaced 100 years ago? So actually, if you think you have the right, then you should accept the right of return. It's that simple. Unless you think a Jew is more worth than an Arab or a Muslim or a Christian. There were Jews who are native to Palestine, who mostly resided in the cities. Some of these Jews, by the way, were expelled by Europeans from Spain and were welcomed by the Arabo-Islamic empires that existed here. But there is no evidence or no claim to be made about, European Jews to this land, precisely because I don't think anyone also as a Muslim or a Christian can go and claim another land, because there's a confusion here between an emotional attachment, between a religious perhaps longing that is connected to religious sites in Palestine, and the right to claim that land politically, and on top of that to deny the people who have been living there for hundreds or thousands of years, regardless of their religion, to the right, especially if they're not Jewish in this case, the right to the land. So the Zionist argument that we were here 2,000 years ago, well, if you think you have the right to go back after 2,000 years, I would assume you also think you have the right to go back after 50 years. So this is one. The second is there's no evidence that these referred to Jewish states existed in this region, and not in all of Palestine, by the way. So if they want to do that claim, they should just go to certain regions of Palestine. While you have other polities that existed, the word Palestine has been used by the Byzantines, the Muslims, the Greeks, by everybody to refer to this land. And so you see that this narrative, not is it only historically inaccurate, it's inconsistent.
But if you want to go this way, aren't the Palestinians today, are we just the
descendants?
Yeah, the descendants of the people, a mix of the people living in the land, and the Jews coming from, if you want to go to biblical terms as they used, the Jews coming from Egypt inside to the land, mixing with the Canaanites and so on and so on.
I don't want to invoke the biblical narrative. What I will say is this region, historically, is one of the oldest inhabited, cultivated, civilized regions, civilized in brackets here, but people in the history. Palestine was not separate from the rest of this region. The people who lived in this land have existed for maybe 10,000 years, maybe. They are peasants, they are merchants, they are seafarers. There has been conquests of this land by all sorts of, by the Egyptians historically, by the Hyksos, by the Byzantines. None of this gives anybody the right to actually displace or dispossess or exterminate the people who have been living on the land under this pretext. And we know that the vast majority of the Jews who were Zionists and came from Europe did not have direct connections to this land. So this is a historic fact. So the point here is, if you have a claim, other people have twice your claim, 3 times your claim, 5 times your claim. And more importantly, maybe we haven't talked about this, the Zionists, the early Zionists, they explicitly thought of this plan as part of European, it's not just about Jewish history. By the way, the early Zionists, many of them were Christian Zionists. Lord Palmerston, the first person to invoke a Jewish potential state is Napoleon. But he spoke to the Eastern Jews. And he used that to incite them against the Ottomans. And many Palestinian Jews, because I know this term sometimes people are not used to it, or Arab Jews, refused. The second most important character is Lord Palmerston, who was the British Prime Minister. Palmerston explicitly said, what happened, I don't want to go to too much detail, when the Muhammad Ali, the governor of Egypt, invaded this part of the world, the British were alarmed that if this Syria and Egypt became one country, it's going to jeopardize the British passageways to India. And so what I'm trying to tell you is the settler colonial state is not just about this question of Jewish or Arab or Islamic history. It's the question of how these European countries, and continue today, now it's the United States, support the existence of a religious-based ethno-supremacist identity to divide and partition this land. So the settler colonial project, the Zionists themselves, they explicitly said our best friends are going to be the anti-Semites. So Herzl, for example, would say, those who are going to be convinced of a project are the anti-Semites, because this way for them we get rid of the Jews in Europe and we put them here. And if the Europeans are so worried about the Jews, and the Holocaust was committed by Europeans, not by Palestinians, not by Arabs, why don't they give them a piece of land of Germany? I say this because I want to say that somehow Arab land is more disposable, is more debatable than German land or than French land. And this is another feature of colonialism that, and also settler colonial projects, Zionist ones, they thought of Argentina, they thought of Madagascar. Obviously, eventually they voted for Palestine because they thought there was a spiritual attachment. But what I want to say is also they thought that the people of Madagascar, why ask them what they think? Why ask what the Argentinians think? So this is a mentality that is a settler colonial mentality. One of its expression is Zionism.
Just here for the because we could sit under this tree and talk until it gets dark with no problem, I believe, about this. And but just here, just to last question here for the end. I don't know how you develop skills, or if you develop any skills, talking about looking into the future as a historian, looking back. But if we look ahead of us in 20 years, me personally, I can't see. I don't believe it's possible for both being a Palestinian and an Israeli state. in 20 years? Is either it's a Palestine or it's an Israeli state? What do you believe from everything you know from history and what's happening now around us? How do you analyze the situation?
The Zionists themselves have shown that they themselves will never accept a Palestinian state. As a matter of fact, we do have a concrete example in the Oslo process and Oslo Accords. The Palestinians, because this is another thing in the West, they keep saying the Palestinians do not want peace, do not want a state solution. When, in a historic moment, the Palestinian leadership, which many people of course think this was a big mistake, but regardless, accepted this idea, what happened? The Israelis used that to actually expand settlement, to confiscate and absorb more land into Israel. And the nature of the Israeli state, that is based on this idea of a Jewish-only state, will never accept another state or people around it that is strong enough, that is sovereign enough, because it will always think the same way it treated the Palestinians are going to treat it. So that's one. The Israelis themselves do not see that. I also think on the ground today, there is very little not just support, resources or perhaps grounds for a Palestinian state. I think this solution is dead. It's been dead a long time ago. I think the only reasonable solution is the end of a genocidal apartheid state, is the creation of a state for all its people.
But what is the realistic solution?
That is the realistic solution.
Do you think it's the realistic?
It's the only solution. The other alternative is constant warfare, is potential cycles of genocide and cleansing, is the elimination of a people. And I think that even the most radical Palestinian movements, they have all explicitly said that whether you're Jewish or non-Jewish, if you are willing to live under Palestinian sovereignty, you will be treated as such. So again, there is no reason to think that this is not possible, except to say, unfortunately today, I used to think, to be very honest, that this future is closer. And some people think still that today, but the way the war has kind of shown itself, I am worried, because I feel this is an era of, although this could be the last throes of the Israeli settler colonial project, but I see a rise of Israeli Zionist kind of the word I want to use is millenarian almost logic that is strongly supported by the United States, and I'm not sure there are political forces now. The project we're talking about, I think a lot of people, when they said from the river to the sea, that's what they meant. But I'm not sure we have the international order today and the political balance of power. I am not seeing this happening very soon, but I do think that is the just and long-term solution to this conflict.
Yeah.
I don't think there was ever since the Nakba, since the occupation of Palestine, since the colonial project has started in Palestine, there has not been a Palestinian state. This Palestinian Authority, or whatever geography, is only another form of, now referring to Fanon, another form of colonized geography. So they created new conditions for their colonial presence to continue existing. And I think what we have today is an Israel, and is an occupation, is a settler colonial project that still exists, that didn't stop existing. I think we're closer to be conscious about that as peoples of this region, now that they're occupying more land in Syria, now that they are occupying Lebanon and constantly threatening Lebanon. And for me, the occupation of Lebanon is not only geographic; it's also in the radaring of Lebanon from north to south, east to west. We're submitted, as we sit here under this tree, to threats of Israeli drones and intelligence and so on. They're controlling the country in that sense, and I think the more aware we are to this, the closest we are to liberating Palestine and liberating ourselves from this settler colonial project. So I think no two states ever since occupation.
No, I don't even mean
and I understand, and I think we're going closer to the liberation of Palestine. So 20 years from now,
how does it look?
I think we are in the final steps of liberating Palestine
and
the region, that is.
When people say Israel and Palestine state, what do they mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Do they mean Israeli state in which if you are a Jew anywhere in the world you have the right to migrate, but if you're an Arab do not have the right to return? Do they mean a state in which you have laws that distinguish? You mean an apartheid Israeli state? You know, I don't understand. People say that in general, and they accuse people who argue for full equality as being unrealistic. Whereas generally speaking, most people would not accept a apartheid state anywhere else. When we talk about an Islamic state somewhere or a Christian state, most especially liberals, I'm here attacking liberals, they are appalled. But then somehow their vision of a peace is actually consecration and consolidation of an apartheid segregative system. So even that project means literally, possibly, cleansing all Arabs who are still in 1948, or if not, means
which is the plan?
Well, or making sure they continue to be second-class citizens,
or cleanse all those who politically cleanse all those who would consider themselves Palestinians or Arabs or peoples of the region. So to get to the extent that's a plan, as said, to eliminate anyone, even the memory. And that's not gonna it's an impossible project, because we still see the Inca today calling themselves Inca in Mexico, now called Mexico. So I think this idea, this colonial supremacist idea, is just absurd.
But I even believe this, even in my worst days, that they will succeed in expelling the Palestinians, even the Palestinians in 48 and so on. But even if this happens, I believe at some, let's say the empty whole of Palestine for Palestinians, or what they call Israel for Palestinians, I believe eventually one day we will get, maybe long after 20 years, we will get it back someday, because they can never survive in the region surrounded by half a billion Arabs. In the long run, they can never survive. Maybe
with their supremacist.
But we have also people have to act, obviously, to implement that, right? Like
we cannot sit
because if we have Arab states and Arab governments who are actually not only normalizing, they are denying the right to take food, bring food into Gaza. This is the kind of regimes we have, you know. Then we have to think about that. What does that? And that's why Israel, by the way, is so eager to normalize with all these countries, because it always has this kind of fear, quote unquote, that its project will never fully succeed. So, yes, I agree with you, but history also is about agency and acting to implement a future. And so this is the challenge of how do we do that, and how to make sure that, look, to end maybe with history, you know, this is not a cliche. This region has a history of coexistence, has a history of multi-ethnic, multi-religious communities. Maybe I didn't want to bring up my village, but in my village, which was pulverized by the Israelis in this war, they destroyed or tried to destroy the shrine of Simeon, who was believed to be one of Jesus's disciples. And a pseudo-archaeologist called Ze'ef Arlich was embedded with the Israeli army, and he came to my village and he stood there and he used this historic site to claim the land. And my point is, it's regardless of who the religious heritage is in that village, that religious heritage does not translate into an inherent claim to the land. So we have a long history, and maybe I was thinking part of the problem we are facing today in this region is that the colonial project of homogenizing us did not succeed in the Levant. Unfortunately, now there are attempts to make us that way. So we had Christians, Muslims, and Jews, and other ethnicities, Kurdish, Arab, Armenian, and maybe that's part of our both blessing and curse. But also colonial projects don't like this heterogeneity. And so this Israel now, what is she trying to? It's trying to create this region in its image. It wants to create a Druze state in Syria. It wanted to create a Maronite state in Lebanon, because it thinks that that's the logic of Israel. And so our struggle is to make sure that our region does not start resembling Israel, and that we actually reverse this trend and eliminate that kind of logic that exists in our midst.
With those words, so we go back back to work the land.
Yes, picking back to work here. The so-called working class is actually picking some mulberries and eating them.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Me
Thank
too.
you.